So to introduce Professor Alex David Rogers, if you haven't heard of him, he's another one of our incredibly amazing global rock star scientists. He's the science director of Rev Ocean in Norway, a visiting professor at the Department of Zoology in the University of Oxford, and a senior research fellow of Somerville College, University of Oxford. He's a marine ecologist who's interested in how biodiversity is distributed in the ocean, especially in the deep sea and on tropical coral reefs. He's also interested in human impacts on the ocean and how to manage human activities to mitigate or reduce degradation of marine ecosystems. His work has taken him to the Atlantic, Indian, and Southern Oceans, and to the Caribbean, investigating coral reef ecosystems, seamounts, and deep sea hydrothermal vents. He's worked with many people across governments, intergovernmental NGOs, and publicised human impacts. And we welcome him today. Alex, handing over to you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to talk to everybody today about the carbon cycle, life in the ocean, and climate mitigation. So could I have the next slide, please? So what is blue carbon? Well, essentially it refers to marine ecosystems and species, I guess, that sequester and store carbon with a significant impact on atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And to qualify as a blue carbon system, that storage or sequestering of CO2 must be for a long time, so centuries to millennia, and it must have the ability to be influenced by human intervention or human activities, such as the methods we use for fishing, or our effects on marine habitats. But it's also important to consider the implications of our activities in terms of damage to ecosystems and biodiversity that, as a result, release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So over the last, I guess, 5 years, much of the emphasis on discussions around blue carbon has been on coastal ecosystems. And in particular, 3 ecosystems stand out in those discussions: mangrove forests, salt marshes, and seagrass beds. And these ecosystems sequester carbon dioxide through the living biomass, the tissues that they accrete above ground, the living biomass, so the roots and shoots of these ecosystems below ground, but also, and probably most significantly, their ability to trap organic carbon in terms of particulate organic matter in the sediments that they accumulate. There have also been discussions around seaweeds or kelp, but because of the fact that there are relatively little sediments actually accumulated within kelp forests, these have been really not considered that strongly in terms of blue carbon ecosystems, although that is changing, and I'll come to that later in the talk. Next slide, please. So if we look at carbon sequestration in these ecosystems, you'll see some figures here. Mangrove forests, 17 to 34 teragrams of carbon per year. Salt marshes, 4.8 to 87.2, and seagrasses, 7.6 to 112. And the first thing you'll notice there is a big variation in the figures, and that comes from 2 sources. One is the fact that there is variation geographically in how much these ecosystems can sequester, but also the fact that there is some uncertainty in these figures, and uncertainty in the areas that these ecosystems actually occupy. And you'll see here also figures for carbon stocks. That's in petagrams or billion tons of carbon So this is the overall carbon held within these systems, and annual losses and the equivalent in terms of CO2. And those losses are in the form of habitat destruction, mainly as a result of human activity. And it's estimated that the current rate of loss is something like 0.45 gigatons of CO2 per year. And that if we actually restored these ecosystems to 1990 levels in terms of area, they would be able to sequester a further 160 teragrams of carbon per year. That's 160 million tons of carbon per annum. Next slide, please. However, it is now being realized that in fact, other ocean systems are probably very important in terms of carbon sequestration in the ocean. And this has been called oceanic blue carbon in many cases. And the first hints we had that there was something interesting going on here, I suppose, was from research on whales. The first study by Pershing et al. In 2010 looked at the carbon sequestration which would occur in whales or as a result of whales in terms of their living biomass, and also the falling of dead whale carcasses into the deep ocean pre-whaling. You see here a figure of 1.9 teragrams of carbon per year in terms of dead whales dropping to the ocean floor. Bear in mind that the figures for our coastal blue carbon ecosystems are up to more than 100 teragrams per year. So actually, this is quite a small effect compared to some of these coastal ecosystems. Another study addressed a question that, that was raised about the effect of recovering whale stocks in the Southern Ocean. There was a suggestion that recovery of whales in the Southern Ocean would actually reduce the efficiency of the biological carbon pump in the Southern Ocean. But actually, it turns out that because of the foraging activities of whales, they reduce through rather natural processes, which you can see illustrated in this photograph of sperm whales here. They release iron into the surface layers of the ocean. And of course, iron is a limiting micronutrient in the Southern Ocean. And actually, the presence of increased numbers of whales leads to an increase in primary production and an increase in sinking carbon in the Southern Ocean, not a decrease. Next slide, please. So we've discovered that whales can actually influence the ocean carbon cycle in all sorts of ways. So as I said, they fall to the ocean as large chunks of carbon when they die. They fertilize surface layers of the ocean. They transport carbon across the ocean. So there's a whole variety of ways in which these animals influence the carbon cycle in the ocean, actually draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and into the deep ocean for long-term storage. Next slide, please. This has led to actually consideration of a wide number of other groups of organisms and ecosystems in terms of their carbon sequestration capacity. This is everything from the effects of coastal food webs, where obviously we have this production of plant matter by coastal ecosystems like seagrass beds, but of course herbivores feed on those, predators feed on the herbivores, and that carbon is transported out into continental shelves, and then a portion of that ends up in shelf sediments. There's what's called the active biological pump, where fish that live in the twilight zone, so this is between 200 and 1,000 meters in the ocean, move up to the surface of the ocean and feed during the day, and then feed during the night, and then dive down into the deep ocean during the day. And through various processes such as production of fecal pellets, predation and so on, they're actively transporting carbon into the deep ocean. And given there's something like 10 to 20 billion tons of these fish in the ocean, that process really draws down a considerable amount of carbon. Next slide, please. So we kind of answered the question whether or not these systems influence the carbon cycle, and the answer to that is yes. But the next question to consider these as blue carbon ecosystems is whether our activities can actually influence these carbon sinks. And the answer to that question is obviously yes as well. So the process of climate change itself is reducing ocean primary production through an increase in the stratification of the ocean, so prevention of mixing of nutrient-rich deep water with surface water layers, which stimulates primary production. It also has other effects as well, such as reducing the body size of fish and so on. And all of these things actually impact on the ocean carbon cycle. Fishing has a number of effects which are relevant as well. It reduces the biomass of obviously targeted species. It potentially reduces active transport of carbon. It affects, certainly when you're using things like trawling to catch your fish, it can affect the release of carbon from sediments. There are also bycatch considerations as well. So if we're catching as a result of fishing activities, things like seabirds, those birds have a function in terms of fertilizing the ocean through defecation, and that of course affects primary production. And of course, there are other activities that we engage in that potentially destroy habitat in the ocean, such as dredging, the potential for ocean mining and pollution. Next slide, please. So one example of how we actually influence the carbon cycle in the ocean is trawling. And a recent study by Henri Sala, just released over the last week, estimated that we trawl something like 4.9 million square kilometers of the seafloor every year. It's about 1.3% of the seafloor. As a result, we increase CO2 emissions as a result of increased carbon metabolism in sediments by 1.47 petagrams a year in the early years of the fishery. And this reduces to about 0.58 petagrams of carbon per annum. That's billion tons of carbon. So this is actually a really quite a significant process in terms of re-releasing CO2 that's been sequestered in sediments. Next slide, please. Another interesting area which is arising essentially because of our overfishing of larger fish in the ocean is that we're starting to look at new fisheries resources which rely on smaller species. This is a classic example of fishing down the food web. And one area that's of particular interest is fishing mesopelagic fish. Now, as I've said, these are very important in terms of active transport of carbon. They transport 900 to 3,600 teragrams of carbon per year into the deep ocean, where it's sequestered for hundreds of years. So you can see here where even taking a small percentage of mesopelagic fish biomass, converting those to fish meal or whatever it is to feed salmon or feed farm animals, could result in a really significant emission of CO2 into the atmosphere where it would have been sequestered. And you will also notice that these numbers are actually quite big, even compared to our coastal blue blue ecosystems. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned seaweeds at the start of the talk and the fact that they'd been largely ignored as blue carbon systems because of this issue with not storing carbon in sediments. However, it has been discovered that, in fact, they do export a lot of particulate organic material into coastal and deep sea sediments. So the natural weathering of seaweed fronds, every day more or less, and the production of dissolved organic matter, that material is transported away from kelp forests and ends up buried in marine sediments or buried in the deep sea, or a portion of it does. Macroalgal forests cover up to about 4.3 million square kilometers, and potentially they sequester about 173 teragrams of carbon per year. That's a million tons. And these numbers are still quite uncertain. So you'll see a range here of 61 to 268 teragrams. So actually, seaweeds are an important blue carbon system. Next slide, please. So seaweed forests, however, are quite dynamic systems, and therefore, unlike things like mangrove forests, which potentially are certifiable in terms of CO2 sequestration through programs like REDD+, it would be very difficult to certify CO2 uptake by a natural kelp forest. However, we do have the ability to cultivate seaweeds. And in fact, annual production at the moment is about 27.3 million tons of seaweeds, and we're seeing a growth of about 8% per year in terms of seaweed farms. And these currently cover about 1,900 square kilometers. But there is a potential area for seaweed cultivation of about 48 million square kilometers. Now, only a small fraction of this is likely to be really farmable, and in fact, it would not be desirable to overdo it in terms of kelp farming, as with other forms of aquaculture. But seaweeds do have a strong potential to contribute to individual countries' nationally defined contributions. And the reason for that is that we're now realizing that something like 10 to 30% of that seaweed that's farmed ends up getting sequestered into the marine environment, and a portion of that ends up being stored over the long term. Next slide, please. So to summarize that, coastal blue carbon is now recognized as a certifiable mechanism of carbon sequestration. However, oceanic blue carbon has enormous potential and is clearly affected by human activities. So we need to start thinking about this. There's need for more research to understand the mechanisms and quantities involved in carbon sequestration and emission pathways in the ocean, particularly through these oceanic pathways. And ocean management is going to be important in terms of understanding how our activities affect CO2 emissions from these ecosystems. And in fact, we can reduce direct carbon emissions in terms of things like fuel use from fisheries, but also indirect emissions through things like overfishing, habitat destruction, and fishing down the food web. And finally, our understanding of carbon sequestration by seaweeds is increasing, and seaweed farming may be an interesting avenue to go down in terms of certifiable CO2 sequestration. And that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. That was fantastic. If people would either like to put their questions into the chat or raise your hand, then that would be great. So we have one question. What precisely is the mechanism for the release of CO2 from trawling?
Yes, that's very interesting. So trawling resuspends sediment, and that sediment contains sequestered organic carbon in terms of particulate organic carbon. So effectively, you remobilize that carbon when a trawl passes along the sea floor. The trawl doors and the nets obviously disturb the sediment down to a certain depth. And once that carbon is remobilized, it starts to be broken down by both organisms and microorganisms, both in the upper layers of the seafloor and also in the water column itself. This resuspension of sediment is really significant, and it's been demonstrated, for example, in the Mediterranean, that sediment resuspension by trawling is actually of a similar magnitude or even greater than natural sediment resuspension processes. I hope that's helpful.
That seemed very clear to me. Thanks, Alex. Has anyone else got any questions? If you don't know how to use the hand raising function, you can just turn your video on and or turn your microphone off. Or you click on the little reactions smiley emoji and the raise hand option is there. I think it was a very clear presentation, Alex, so perhaps people don't have any extra questions.
That's fine. People are welcome to ask questions in the chat later, or we can address it.
Absolutely. That's also true.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello, Rashid.
Yeah. So, Alex, I just want to say thank you for that. It's really cool. I mean, and the way you structured it, starting from what we know is common to talk about and going down there. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot too. And I'm saying this as a co-author, so this is fun. Thank you.
Yeah, one thing I would say, Rashid, is in starting this research, we are potentially starting to see a link here between the potential to emit quite large quantities of CO2 and this concept of fishing down the food web. It's fascinating to see that things like whales actually have a relatively small effect, although it's significant in terms of the carbon cycle, at least in terms of deadfall anyway. There are other processes they're involved in. But when you start thinking about small but very abundant fish, then the numbers start to crank up very, very quickly. And once you start to affect those types of, boxes within the ecosystem, then there's real potential for human activity to influence emissions.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is probably is it purely because of the large numbers or what? So
yeah, it's the huge biomass and the fact that these organisms are, in the case of mesopelagic fish, they're migrating between the surface ocean and into the deep ocean. They're almost acting as a transport system for conveying carbon into the deep sea. And once that carbon goes below 400 meters, we're talking about storage of over 300 years. And I just noticed the mentioning here of Oceanic worms recycling deadfall carbon on whale carcasses. Well, yes, they're recycling it, but they're recycling it at depths of 3,000 or 4,000 meters. So that carbon, even if it's respired by the animals which are recycling it, it's not getting to the surface anytime soon.
Yeah. So if I can just follow up, you are a Southern Ocean person. Yeah. How do krill, how do they play into this carbon business? Because So
Yeah, there's been a couple of studies recently on Antarctic krill. I think Mark Belcher from British Antarctic Survey published a paper in 2019 looking at the effect of krill on CO2 sequestration in the Antarctic convergence zone, I think. It's a certain zone of the Southern Ocean. I think the figure was around 32 teragrams of carbon per annum. So quite a big number. And again, this idea of the small but numerous organisms in the ocean being quite important in terms of moving carbon around comes through in that study as well. Krill also do some things that we've only just realized. So they actually go down to the sea floor 1,000 or more meters deep and feed there and pick up iron and bring it up to the surface and release it. We didn't realize that happened previously. So again, they're kind of fertilizing the ocean and producing phytoplankton production, which they then feed on. This is the thing, our knowledge of the real details of carbon cycle for many of these ecosystems and organisms is still very, very basic.
Fantastic. Yeah, I can see a gold mine for an economist like me, right? I mean, comparing the value of krill in the way you explain it than catching it and grinding it for other things, right? I mean, that could be quite exciting thing to do. Thank you so much, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Rashid.
Fantastic. That was excellent. Excellent questions and responses. Okay, so there's a couple more questions. So we'll just, if we could be quite quick with these, because then we do want to make sure that we have enough time in the workshops, because we can have some more discussion in the workshops too.
Very quick.
Okay. So can you see those questions, Alex? Yeah, great.
The density stratification pump. If I interpret that properly, there's a paper by Boyd et al. 2019, which deals with all aspects of the biological carbon pump that are not the gravity pump, effectively. So if you have a look at that paper, it's got some really good numbers. In fact, the first numbers for many of these mechanisms in it. That's views on options to manage fisheries. Yeah, I mean, this is what we're kind of starting to get at in terms of what I was talking about in the role of a much broader range of marine ecosystems and species in terms of carbon sequestration. And I think we certainly can think about ways to manage fisheries that help protect some of these functions. I mean, the first one is to stop overfishing, and the second one is to stop destructive fishing practices. So practices which involve high bycatch or which seriously disturb the seafloor are really big no-nos in terms of driving carbon emissions from fishing. We have to balance this with the fact that fishing and aquaculture, in terms of production of animal protein, or indeed plant protein in the case of macroalgae, are less impacting in terms of emissions than terrestrial forms of agriculture. And in fact, the ocean clearly has a big role in feeding the global population over the next 20, 30 years. But we've got to do it in a way which avoids emissions as much as possible and maintains these sequestration functions.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thank you so much. Super useful, enlightening, and interesting.